So we are moving on to the next module, that's outsourcing and vertical contract. So far what you have learned in your theory of firm, whatever the classical theories are there to offer, is that the firms has to decide on the how far to integrate. So it must give you a theory of integration. And in the process of that integration, the main question to ask whether to make or buy something, okay, from the market. So any activity that you are thinking of either internalizing that so that you make that, or you can simply procure that from the market. So this make and buy decision was of the paramount importance in the existing theories of the firms. And so as a result, the main thrust point in those was that incomplete contract, the transaction costs related to the outside as well as inside transaction, and that was supposed to define the boundaries of the firm. So if you look at the all four theories, and if you read Gibbon's that Jebo article of four formalizable theories of the firm, you will find that they are essentially looking at that the incomplete contract and transaction cost related issues which are defining the boundary of the firm, and the emphasis was mainly on the hold-up problem. Okay. However, when you are thinking of making or buying decision, that decision is not an unilateral decision, just looking at the cost of the outside transaction. Okay. So in other words, if you look at today's world, the markets are typically imperfectly competitive in nature. So that means that whatever market you are looking at, you will find that they are mostly oligopolistic in nature. Sometimes the number of firms are slightly more as compared to some other markets where the number of firms are really small. Okay. So the standard, the duopoly example that you give is essentially in the aviation industry, that Boeing and Airbus. Okay. So you know that these are the main two firms which basically develop all the commercial helicopter, and they lease out to different companies all across the globe. Okay, so this is taken as the classic example of duopoly situation, and not only in the global context, you can see in many different contexts that the number of firms may be small, and in some cases, the number of firms may be somewhat larger, but whatever they are essentially going to create an imperfectly competitive market environment. Okay. So now, if we just go and think beyond these incomplete contract transaction cost related issues, which are defining the boundaries of the firm, there might be reasons of making or buying for the firms simply from the point of view of the strategic consideration. Now, when I say strategic consideration, that means that if you simply go by your own cost and benefit consideration, then there is no justification of going to buy something from the market. Okay, but you might like to buy something from our market, so which we call that outsource or subcontract some activities to the other entities in order to take advantage in the competition that you are doing with other final good producers. So for example, you can develop your own input. So you prepare your own input and then produce the final output and then compete in the market, or you can simply outsource the input from a third party. And that input supplier could be not only supplying to you, but it could be also supplying to your rival. Okay. But when you are doing that with a specific purpose, that is from the point of view of taking some strategic advantage in the final good sector where you are actually competing with your rival. Okay. So in order to take certain strategic advantage, the firms often take recourse to either subcontracting or outsourcing. Okay, and this particular literature is somewhat new in the latest kind of literature. So you will see that all the papers that will be mentioning here, they are all post 2000 papers. Okay, So they are very recent papers, and they have looked into the strategic aspects of this make or buy decision. And so that's how this literature is developed. Now, when we think of outsourcing, now just a couple of motivating examples. Now, the first paper that we'll be doing is from Sai and Stan Becker, 2003 Journal of Economic Behavior and Organizations on strategic outsourcing. So this paper motivates with the example that General Motors produces 10 cars per employee in a year, okay? And Toyota produces 70 cars per employee in a year, okay? So that means Japanese producers use subcontracting extensively. Now, can you imagine 70 cars per year Toyota is producing, okay? So which means that essentially one person in 365 days will be producing 70 cars, okay? So you can imagine that the level of outsourcing that is done, okay? So it is simply the assembly done by few people, and most of the components are typically outsourced, and that's how it is done. Now, Intel processor was used for CPU for most PC manufacturers. So Intel produces the producers for most of the PC manufacturers. Boeing and Airbus was duopoly in aviation industry, and Boeing outsourced 34,000 components to outsiders for its 747 passenger carrier, okay? So you can imagine that when something goes wrong in all these beautiful ship and all, so you know that whom to blame, you don't know whom to blame, because if so many components and so many parts and machineries are outsourced from outsiders, then essentially if everything is not calibrated and kind of efficiently done, you can easily imagine the problem that you will face. And you typically see in the context of car manufacturers regularly from the newspaper that there are occasional recall of certain cars, okay, and they have certain things to fix. The companies recall those cars and they fix them. And the why that kind of things happen, the main reason why that happens is not that there is incompetency on the part of the company, but companies naturally rely on many components which are outsourced from outside, okay? Now, if anything goes wrong anywhere in the whole chain of the system, then you can easily see that that final outcome will also be problematic. Okay, so the latest round of recall is being done by Maruti Suzuki. Okay, you can read that in the newspaper. Okay, and the main reasons for all these recalls are not only that there might be something wrong inside the factory itself, but the main reason is that they are relying heavily on outsourced components, and which could be problematic. Okay. So these are the kind of intensity of outsourcing for any farm or any industry that is happening. And here are just few examples of that sort. So now let me just take you through the kind of structure that we will follow in this particular module. So we'll be doing about 6-7 models here, but the models are essentially one paper, but those papers we'll be doing in a very simplified manner. Okay. And so what we'll do, we'll take the cases of two final good producers. So these are two firms. Okay. And then there will be an input market. So final goods, there are only two firms, they are producing final good. Then there is input market. Now in the input market, what will happen, we will gradually change the assumption from one to another. So input market could be, there are plenty of firms, so the inputs are competitively supplied and the firms are going to buy the input from the market. Okay. Or there can be that input markets are also imperfectly competitive. And the classic imperfection is, suppose the input market is monopoly. Okay. And in that case, there is only one input supplier, and that input supplier is going to supply in the input market. And these two final good producers can decide whether to buy input from that input supplier or produce something in-house. Okay. So that would be our line of inquiry. Okay, so the first model we'll be looking at that we have two firms, they move simultaneously, but inputs are competitively supplied at a fixed price. Second model will just simply change one part. That part is input supplied by a monopolist, and we'll see how the results change from model 1 to model 2. Okay. Then third model is sequential move and monopoly input supplier. So we are keeping monopoly input supplier, but these two were simultaneous move. Now we'll move into sequential move structure, and we'll see that what will happen. So the question that we'll raise here, who would outsource, leader or follower? This paper, which came immediately after 3 years, closely related to this Science Sternbecker in the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organizations. And that journal has a good standing. It is typically perceived to be top 20, 30 journals. Okay. Now then another one, model 4, which we may not be doing fully, but we will be looking at that whether the outsourcing can be strategically used by a final good producer to become a stakeholder leader in the market of final good. Okay. Then we'll also go into model 5, where we'll see that this, until so far, we were thinking, until model 3, we were thinking that input sellers are basically maximizing its payoff and doing it by charging uniform prices to both the final good producers. Now what we will see, we will try to see that model 4 and 5, especially in 5, that input sellers actually can treat two different final good producers differently, and in fact it can actually favor one party, okay, one of the final good producers, and by doing so it can maximize its payoff, and that would be a story of outsourcing with playing favorites by the input sellers. Okay. Then we will also talk about outsourcing with technology transfer. This is based on one of my paper. And then this model 7 is outsourcing with discriminatory contracts. So this is partly related to what I was just talking about, the model 5, that input sellers can discriminate in when it chooses prices for the final good producers, and that discrimination can actually lead to outcomes which will be of interest. Now, this particular paper was in the question paper of the last year. Okay, so I will give you the full answer of this particular, all the questions that was given in the question paper last year. Okay, and this is not to be covered, but I was just towards the end, I will give some concluding remarks about outsourcing, what are the other ways to look at the outsourcing, and in fact, you can think of incomplete information game, and there also you can actually find out the rationale for outsourcing. Okay, so these are essentially the stream of things that will follow. Now here, most importantly, what is needed to understand is that when I go from one model to another, you will see that I'm changing just one component or here and there. Okay, and then how people are writing by simply changing one or two places of a model and then developing a different model with different implications and different results. Okay, so this gives you a very good understanding of how research flows in a stream. Okay, so 2003 paper had some focus, then that got slightly tweaked, and then 2006 another paper in the same journal. Okay, and as I told you that these people who are writing, these are big people, they are tenured in top universities in the world. Okay, so don't take these things as lightly, although I will be presenting the bare bone and very simple model to drive home the same result. Okay, and that is another thing you will need to understand when you look at the paper vis-a-vis my presentation, is that if you have a good idea, to present that good idea, you do not need actually very complicated mathematical models to establish. Okay, but sometimes you need to do that mathematically complicated analysis just to publish in good journals. Okay, so to understand that a new idea and to establish with the help of the kind of mathematical proof does not always require very complicated mathematics. But what is important, that if you want to publish in good journal, you might need to pursue in many different directions to make it more complete. and then for the perspective of publication, you might need to do some more complex algebra, okay? But not for understanding and developing new ideas along that line, okay? So you will see that when I develop this particular module, I'll go step by step, one after another, okay? Now let us first start off with the model 1. And here the idea is that here the economies of scale will be of more kind of importance. And economies of scale, by which we mean that everybody needs input. So both the final good producers, they need input, and they can actually buy that input from a competitive input market where the price of the input is fixed, okay? So now when you actually think of producing the input in-house, then you have to install in capacity of the input production. And when you do so, it has two components of the cost. One is there is a ready the kind of the investment that is required and which will be sunk forever. And that's a fixed cost of production that you need to invest in. And the second part is per unit of input that you produce, you have to incur some cost, and that will give you a per unit cost of input production, okay? So now, whenever you find this kind of cost function with fixed cost, one component, and another component, a variable cost, now you can easily see that there is some economies of scale, okay? So in other words, if you look at the average cost now with a fixed cost plus a constant marginal cost component, okay, that's how we'll define. You will see that this particular average cost curve will be declining, and that's what is called the economies of scale. Because of the scale economies, if you increase your level of output, your per unit average cost will come down, okay? And we'll focus on that in the story of outsourcing, when the two final good producers, they have to decide whether to produce in-house or not, okay? So they will make this consideration that they can easily install capacity in their own farm and then produce the input in-house, and they can enjoy the benefit of economies of scale. But until unless they have a very solid demand or very large demand, this installation of input division will not be of much value, okay? So we will be basically focusing on that aspect, okay? So now we will be considering only two-stage game. Stage 1, firms simultaneously choose between outsourcing and in-house production. Inputs are competitively supplied at a fixed price, okay? And one important assumption is that we are making that final good producers need 1 unit of input, okay, to produce 1 unit of final good. Okay, so the cost of production for the final good is the cost of procuring that input, whether by their own production or by buying it from somebody else, okay? And we are assuming that there is no other cost involved in the production process. So in other words, it is just could be thought of as you are buying input and then selling. In the middle, you are not making or incurring any cost. So in a sense that maybe you are doing packaging or not even that. So we are just normalizing that particular activity or cost to zero. Okay, we are only focusing on the input procurement cost, either through own production or by buying from outside. Okay, so the only cost of production for the final good producers will be then the cost of producing input or procuring input. Fine. Any questions?
So,
Yeah.
so when we say that the firms enjoy economies of scale, are we saying the fixed cost decreases or the input cost of input procurement decreases as output increases, or is it both?
No. I have already mentioned what kind of cost function we are looking at. We are looking at cost function where there is a fixed cost component, F, and there is a variable cost, which is per unit, say F plus CQ. Okay. Now, if this is your total cost, if you divide it by Q, then that will be your average cost. And that average cost will be falling forever, whatever be the level of output. That's what is called economies of scale.
Okay.
Okay. So now stage one is simultaneous move choice, and that biometrics game we have just depicted here, that the two firms will be choosing between outsourcing and in-house production. And so, and the second stage, they will be competing in Kurno. Now, so this particular biometrics will be helpful because Kurno will be able to find out the quantities and then profits, and then profits will be actually plug in here, and that then it will be possible for us to actually determine what would be the equilibrium of this biometrics game sitting at stage one. Okay. Both firms have the same cost structure for input production. Okay. And we consider that total cost of production is A plus CQI. I is for the ith firm. And if it is in-house production, and if they are outsourced and bought from the competitive market, then W is the prevailing market price there. And as a result, WQI will be the cost of procuring input. Okay. Okay. So from the outside. So let me just now change the slide and we move on to